Okay, so when we talk about peace in Ukraine, it's not a straight line. It's much more like a giant, incredibly complex puzzle. And in this explainer, we're going to take a close look at all the different pieces.
So, the big question on everyone's mind, is this war finally coming to an end? Well, for the first time in a long time, there are some seriously intensive peace talks happening. But, as we're about to see, the road to actually getting a deal signed is, well, it's anything but simple.
You see, the thing is, there isn't just one single peace plan on the table. What we've really got is a messy collection of competing proposals, non-negotiable red lines, and totally different visions for the future. So let's break down what these different plans are and what the biggest hurdles are that could stop a deal from ever happening.
To really get a grip on where things stand right now, you have to go back to the beginning. We need to look at the two initial proposals from the West that really set the stage for these high-stakes negotiations we're seeing today.
Okay, so just look at how different the starting points were for the US and Europe. The initial American plan, which apparently had some Russian input, suggested capping Ukraine's army at 600,000 and, crucially, required Kyiv to give up its dream of joining NATO. The European plan? Totally different. They envisioned a much larger 800,000-strong military and wanted these Article 5-style security guarantees, all while refusing to recognize any changes to Ukraine's territory.
And just to put those numbers into perspective for you, Ukraine's current military is sitting at around 900,000 active personnel. So, even the lower American proposal would still leave Ukraine with one of the biggest and, let's face it, most battle-hardened armies in all of Europe.
Now, as you can imagine, Kyiv got a look at that initial 28-point U.S. plan and pushed back hard. They felt it was way too favorable to Russia. So U.S. negotiators went back to the drawing board and revised it. This new 19-point framework is what led to what they're calling a common understanding between Washington and Kyiv. This was a really critical step for sure, but it also kind of kicked off a whole new set of problems, especially with Moscow.
So how did Moscow see all this playing out? This part is absolutely central, right? Because at the end of the day, if Russia isn't on board, no deal is possible.
And this quote just nails the Russian perspective. From their point of view, the European proposal was a complete non-starter, basically a plan for never-ending confrontation. That initial U.S. plan, though, they saw it as a realistic, even if flawed, place to start talking, because it actually acknowledged some of their biggest security concerns.
And you have to understand, from Moscow's viewpoint, these points were huge. For the very first time, they were seeing a Western proposal that directly addressed their long-standing demands, slamming the door on NATO expansion, recognizing the facts on the ground territorially, and creating a formally neutral Ukraine to act as a buffer state.
And this is a big but. Russia saw two major strategic red lines in the U.S. plan. The first is something they call the demilitarization trap. Their argument is pretty simple. A 600,000-strong army, trained and equipped by NATO, isn't demilitarization at all. It's just cementing a permanent military threat right on their border.
So, to get around this so-called trap, Moscow came back with its own counter-proposal. It's a two-step process. In Phase 1, you cap the forces and pull them way back from the front lines to create a buffer. Then, in Phase 2, over the next 2 years, you shrink Ukraine's army down to 300,000 troops, which they see as a truly defensive number. And they insist this has to be reciprocal. Their own forces would have to mirror this drawdown.
Okay, so that brings us to Russia's second major red line, and this one is all about the money. We're talking about the roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves that have been frozen. The American plan suggests taking $100 billion of that cash and using it to rebuild Ukraine. For Russia, that is an absolute non-starter. They see it as theft, plain and simple, and they refuse to bankroll what they consider a hostile state. Their demand is for the full return of every single dollar. Only after that, they say, would they set aside $50 billion of their own money to rebuild the territories they now control.
Now, we've spent a lot of time on what Russia wants, but let's be very clear. Ukraine has been just as forceful about its own bottom lines for any potential peace deal.
President Zelensky himself has talked openly about the incredible pressure they're under and the painful concessions on the table. He's framed the choice as one between the very dignity of the nation and the risk of losing its key allies.
So even though they found some common ground with the U.S. in that revised plan, Kyiv's own red lines are crystal clear. Ukrainian officials have been adamant. There will be no legal recognition of occupied lands, no limits on their military that would leave them defenseless, and absolutely no Russian veto on their right to join alliances like the European Union. And above all else, the core principle is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
So
All of this, it brings us right here, to the three massive, unresolved hurdles that could honestly make or break this entire thing. These are the core conflicts that negotiators are wrestling with as we speak.
First up, and this is probably the most painful one of all, territory. That initial U.S. plan apparently required Ukraine to formally give up control over the entire Donbass region. That includes areas Russia hasn't even managed to conquer on the battlefield. For Ukraine, that is an almost unimaginable thing to concede.
The second major sticking point is the future size of Ukraine's military. I mean, just look at the gap. You've got a massive 300,000 troop difference between the number Kyiv is okay with and the number Moscow is demanding as its end goal for what it calls a demilitarized Ukraine.
And third, it's back to the money, the fate of those frozen assets. This really pits two fundamental needs against each other: Ukraine's desperate need for funds to rebuild the country and Russia's claim to its own financial sovereignty, along with its flat-out refusal to pay what it sees as reparations.
So, as the negotiators fly back and forth between capitals, this is the central question that hangs over everything. We're not talking about minor details here. These are fundamental, deep-seated disagreements over sovereignty, security, and basic justice. To bridge these gaps is going to take more than just clever diplomacy. It's going to require a truly historic compromise that, right now at least, feels just out of reach.